So hi everyone, my name is Alina, and today with me I have Edmund. So both Edmund and I are from the car security quarter, and today we'll be talking about the analysis of an in-vehicular network from CAN bus to infotainment for this year's SINCON 2021. So a little bit more on our content that we'll be touching today. So I'll be giving a quick recap on Test Bench 2 and also some updates on Test Bench 2. And then I will also go through the journey of Bench 3. And thereafter, Edmund will be going through the building challenges of Bench 3 and also do a comparison of Bench 2 and 3's architecture and also a summary of our learnings for both Bench 2 and Bench 3. So again, my name is Alina, and I have Edmund over here. And so my interest is in car racing and hence car security quarter. And then I also like to do pen testing on OT and automotive systems as a hobby. And for Edmund, he is also interested in doing hardware hacking and also pen testing on automotive systems. So CSQ is part of the wider cybersecurity community here in Singapore called Division 0. And we also power the Automotive Security Research Group for the Singapore chapter, known as ASRG-SIN. So CSQ has a total members of about 20 plus members, and we meet almost every Friday to do our vehicular research online because of COVID-19 now. And then if you're keen to follow us on Twitter, here's our handle, CSQ Div 0. And then our personal Twitters are beside our names for both Edmund and I. So the goals of CSQ for this interest group is that we want to actually facilitate and promote automotive cybersecurity awareness here to the cybersecurity community in Singapore. And we actually want to empower like-minded security enthusiasts in gaining hands-on experiences. And ultimately, we want to be able to contribute to the automotive security industry through our ground-up research, through vulnerability research, community engagement, speaking conferences like this, and also building of test benches. So over here, I have a picture of us back in 2019 during pre-COVID days. 8 of us were working on test bench 1 at the point of time presenting for, I think, SINCON 2019. Yeah. So let's get started on the updates of Bench 2. So a quick recap on Bench 2 is that we actually chose to build the Test Bench 2 with a couple of critical components. So as we cannot afford the whole car, we actually purchased like the central gateway module, the infotainment unit, and the telematics. So we further improvised and we also added a few more items, the cluster meter and the DDE. So DDE is basically the fuel injection or the diesel injection in this case, for you to actually simulate the vehicle's ignition and stuff to a CAS module, a car access system module. And then we have the test bench here contains 3 different layers to simulate the vehicle's architecture. As you can see, layer 1, we have the infotainment system, the vehicle's DDE, and the central gateway module. And then to even save space, we stacked up the parts. So in layer 2, we have the instrument cluster. We also have the telematics module. And of course, the infotainment system is quite high, so we stack it up there. And then for layer 3, we have the cluster meter and the infotainment screen. So in our case for Bench 3, the infotainment system and the cluster meter is actually joined together. However, because Bench 3 is based on an older generation vehicle, I think it's based in 2014 to 2018. So both the systems are actually separated. And it's also by a different vehicular manufacturer. So one of the things that we found on Bench 2 is that we were able to actually control like the speedometers and stuff to perform like CAN injection on the messages. So we actually were able to control some infotainment values via CAN bus as well. And we also found some interesting findings such as we weren't able to actually send the CAN messages via the OBD2 port. So in our case, when we actually sent out the CAN messages to the OBD2 port, we realized that it was blocked and filtered away. And we actually quickly realized that we had to do a man in the middle in order to inject some of the CAN messages to directly control the vehicle's CAN bus. So in our case, if you actually send these CAN messages to control the cluster meter, you will not be able to see the attacks being reflected only after we do the man in the middle. So after further research, we also found out that one of the particular vehicle ID was able to control the critical components or critical systems, safety critical systems within the vehicle, and this matches the ID shown in the cluster meter. So by resetting the cluster meter, we found out that there's another sub message in the data form that we were able to actually control this critical component, which we will share more in the future talks in the future. So here we have different updates on the bench 2. So in this case, after we done our research, we actually rented a vehicle for us to do this type of attacks, and we concluded that it's actually safe and it does not affect any safety critical components to malfunction. So we actually performed the attacks on the rented vehicle. So for this case, our rented vehicle is the latest, based on the latest model, instead on the previous model that we conducted the attacks on for bench 2. So bench 2 is based on like an older generation, whereas on the vehicle you see here is the newest generation. But more or less the CAN messages is the same, so it doesn't really change. So what we found out is that we were able to connect to the central gateway module and via the Ethernet cable. So we identified that it actually uses a combination of Ethernet and CAN bus, because Ethernet actually stands for Ethernet. And we were also able to locate the internal IP address of the vehicle through the web page of the gateway. So through port 80, we were able to access the web page directly, as opposed to the previous generation of vehicle, which is what we have on our bench 2. We weren't able to actually reach port 80 on the vehicle. And we validated that the central gateway module actually communicates with the vehicle manufacturer's internal server periodically. So a quick search on the website, we found out that the IP address belongs to the vehicle manufacturer on on this IP directory. And then through our testing observations, we realized that the vehicle will log our IP addresses once we are connected to it. So the webpage has quite a few interesting tabs, such as testing of diagnostics functionality. So over here in the webpage itself, you can see that there is different like protocols like FlexRay, Ethernet, and we realized that it's more the webpage itself is very similar to what we have on a computer. So you have your IP address, your network mask, even have an ARP table over here. So as you can see that vehicles, once they evolve, and for newer vehicles, they will act more and more like a sort of a computer on wheels. So now will begin talking about the journey of bench 3. So Test Bench 3 was actually inspired by 360 Group. So 360 Group is also known as Sky Gold over here, and their findings was actually announced in RSA on Black Hat US back in 2020. As we do not have the budget to actually buy the whole vehicle and do the testing, and it's also actually dangerous for us to perform security testing on actual vehicles without enough data points. So what we did was similar to bench 2, we actually chose to build a vehicle test bench to actually simulate the attacks, and then thereafter we'll run a vehicle on which is similar to the make and model of bench 3 to actually perform the attacks, but in a safe manner. So bench 3 was actually completed in November 2020. Since there was already known findings by like 360 Group, and recently Tencent Kinlabs actually launched their research on the same make and model but a newer generation, we wanted to use all of this existing vehicular research to actually enhance our learnings. So similar to Test Bench 2, the central gateway module that we have over here is also known as EIS gateway, which I'll explain a little bit more about it later. Contains most of the vehicular CAN bus protocols. So over here I have the CAN HMI, which is known as the Infotainment CAN bus, and then I have CAN D, known as the Diagnostics CAN bus, and then CAN B, the Body CAN bus. So over here, the diagram that we have is what translates into the right-hand side of the picture where we have the actual test bench over there. So similar to what we have for bench 2 is broken down into different layers. So the infotainment system, as you can't see over here in the picture, is actually hidden beneath the layers. And then earlier I mentioned that this is based on a newer vehicle. So you can actually see that the cluster meter and the infotainment system is actually joined together as a whole panel. And then what is not seen in diagram here is also the USB hub that we actually purchased. And then the telematics module and the EIS gateways is also hidden beneath the additional layers. And we also purchased a central console to actually simulate, you get a really real feel of what the vehicle is like within. And then we also had some of the wirings purchased as well to connect directly to the infotainment system and the cluster meter. So for the component introductions, so as I mentioned earlier, the instrument cluster actually displays the speedometer and the infotainment screen together. It also allows Wi-Fi connectivity and is connected to the infotainment system. So what we did is when we power on the whole test bench, we actually played around with the infotainment system. We actually found that there is a web browser allowing you to surf the internet while you're in the car. So of course the telematics module must be connected to it so that you can actually surf the internet. And then afterwards we actually purchased the infotainment system over here. So the infotainment system that we have over here is NTG 5.5. So as opposed to what Tencent Keen Labs have in their research, that is for NTG 6. So for NTG 6 is actually based on the latest model known as the MBUX. So it's actually a quite a good research. I will urge you to go and look at the research for the latest vehicle for NTG 6. But in our case, because our budget is quite restrained, so for us, we feel that NTG 5.5 is sufficient for us to learn more about this vehicle. And we found out that the real-time operating system's ECU actually power up the infotainment in the vehicle, and it's actually running on the WinCE7 Automotive ARM OS. And then next we have the telematics module over here. So the telematics module is also known as ERMES. So basically the vehicular manufacturer calls it ERMES, and we have the version 1.5 over here. And it actually provides the LTE network connectivity to your cell phone, and also provides the infotainment with internet connectivity through the eSIM functionality. And then in the middle portion, we have the EIS gateway. So EIS stands for Electronic Ignition Switch. So what it does, it acts as a firewall to filter out unwanted CAN messages, and it supports keyless entry functionalities. So it's actually pretty similar to what the actual, like the IT world firewall. So it uses whitelisting to actually whitelist the CAN messages that are pre-approved in the vehicle. So any rogue CAN messages, if you do any spoofing of any rogue CAN messages, it will actually be filtered away by the EIS gateway. And last but not least, we have the USB hub over here. So what the USB hub does is it's providing a connectivity for external USB devices, and it also provides the installation of GPS maps. So what we found out for this vehicle is when we powered the vehicle on directly, we realized that it's actually prompting us for a GPS maps. So one thing we found out is that for this particular vehicle make and model, it's actually a subscription service for you to purchase the GPS maps when you go to the dealer. So in our case, when we because this is a surprise for us, so what we did is we actually purchased this USB hub, and we purchased a separate SD card for us to install the maps for this. But I think that the USB hub is also an interesting attack vector for us to conduct some research on. So they're basically different vehicular protocol introductions, different CAN bus protocols within the vehicle itself. So there are different variations of CAN bus that actually controls different functions within the vehicle. So in here we have CAN B, that I mentioned earlier, the body CAN bus. So it's an interior CAN bus that actually connects to the climate control, or even controls the doors and opening or closing of doors will generate the CAN messages. And then, or let's say if your vehicle has a sunroof, when you open and close the sunroof, it also generates the CAN messages under CAN B. And then for CAN D, we have the diagnostics CAN bus. So the diagnostics CAN bus actually connects to the OBD2. And then we have the CAN HMI over here. So HMI actually stands for human machine interface. So HMI is usually for you to is a human readable kind of format. So it's basically the infotainment CAN bus that actually displays human readable information to the cluster meter and also allows you to interact with it. So as I mentioned earlier, the process of assembling bench tree is over here. When we first sort of assembled bench tree, we have when we power it on, we see that this is in Swedish text. It's basically asking you for SD card to power on the maps. So what we did is we of course changed the language back to English. And then for the infotainment system, we wanted all the wirings to be tucked in nicely into the presentation box over here known as the Pelican case. So what we did is we purchased the Pelican case over here, and then we cut out all the different sizing and placed it like what we did for test bench 2. So ultimately, there's still quite a lot of space for expansion on the bench tree, as you can see right over here. So we can actually add on different components for us to interact with the vehicle. But as of now, this is actually sufficient for us to conduct some different kinds of research and map out different attack vectors. So up next, Edmund will actually be talking more about the building challenges.
Okay, thank you, Alina, for the intro of Bench 2 and Bench 3. So I'll be covering on the challenges that we faced while building the Bench 3. So let me request control for slides. Okay. Okay, so once we connected up the relevant pins that were identified on the cluster meter and infotainment system, so we tried to power up the bench. And from here, we noticed a very familiar setting whereby the screen is not powered up, but we can hear that the head unit is actually running. So relying on our prior experience with Bench 2, we immediately narrowed it to CAN bus wake-up signal that is absent from our setup. So similarly to Bench 2, we had to simulate the CAN bus wake-up signal in order to properly power the bench and receive some visual feedbacks from the instrument cluster and the infotainment screen. So to do this, we had two ways. One is to fuzz out the CAN wake-up signal. However, this will prove to be very tedious as we do not know the baud rate of the CAN bus. And the second way is what we did is through reversing the CAN signals that we are retrieving from an actual vehicle. So we were able to determine the CAN bus baud rate, and we were able to identify some CAN messages to simulate the CAN wake-up signal. So on the below table, we can see the CAN messages, 25D, 2F7, and 020, and on the right, the corresponding wake-up signals or their payloads that were used to as a wake-up message. So running these three signals on the bench setup will enable us to power the bench, and finally we can see some visual response in the cluster. So next. Okay, so once we power up the bench tree, we were immediately faced with another challenge. So after a short while of playing with the CAN bus and injecting whatever CAN messages we want to find out what are some of the features that are available in the vehicle, a pop-up screen was seen, which is coming from the anti-theft protection module. So after further research, we identified that the one we are triggering is on level A, seen on the bottom left picture. And it is relatively easy to fix, whereby we only need to follow the instruction, which is to switch the ignition on and restart the system. So what we had to do on the bench, right, is actually just to turn it off and then turn it on again while injecting a startup CAN message sequence pertaining to ignition restart. So to do this, we actually captured the CAN messages from an actual vehicle, and we replayed back this CAN attack into our bench, and then subsequently the anti-theft was removed. So we also found out that there's actually two other levels, level B and level C for anti-theft. So level B in the middle will require the developer's assistance to remove, and this is for a VIN mismatch. So the VIN mismatch will mean that the infotainment system is actually seeing other ECUs that do not belong to the same VIN as itself, and this message will pop up. So for level C, it also requires developer assistance to remove, and this is activated if we keep replaying CAN messages without removing, let's say, level A. So we were fortunate that we were getting the level A, which is very easy to remove. So within this bench tree, the identified attack chain can be performed with the following activities. So the first one is the infotainment browser, which we can access through the infotainment system. So after that, we can achieve RCE through browser vulnerability to compromise the infotainment system, and then plant a backdoor in the infotainment system for future testing. And lastly, we will perform the lateral movement towards controlling vehicular components and also other vehicle ECUs that are reachable through the infotainment system. So next we'll look at some of the similarities and differences in bench 2 and 3. So on the left, we have the top layer layout for our bench 2. On the right is the top layer bench 3 layout. So for bench 2 at the top, you can see the instrument cluster, which contains the speedometer, tachometer, fuel gauge, and also the engine temperature gauges. It also provides feedback that requires driver attention, such as the seatbelt warning, airbags, and etc. So at the bottom, you see the infotainment screen, and beside it is the controller for the infotainment unit. So infotainment is where you see your maps, navigation, and also your music and telephone operations. And beneath this top layer is the other components that we have connected to bench 2. So if you can remember from our last presentation, it will be the TCB, which is the telecommunication box, and then the central gateway, and also the DDE, which is the diesel digital electronics. And similarly on the bench tree, the top layer, at the top you can see the infotainment screen and also the cluster meter, which is combined into one long display screen. So the speedo and tacho can be seen, and then the one with the car image is your infotainment screen. And below it, there's a very big center console, and right at the bottom is the controls for the infotainment system. So the setup is basically very similar, and at the bottom, as Alina mentioned earlier, are all the components that she mentioned that are connected beneath to make the whole thing work. Okay. So through hands-on building of the two benches and research into the different vehicular networks, we can see a lot of similarities in these two benches. For the top picture, you can see is for the bench 2, and at the bottom is for the bench 3. So they both have central gateway, and for the bench 2 at the top, it's named ZGW, and for bench 3 is EIS. So this central gateway actually connects various CAN bus connections to the vehicle. For example, the diagnostics, powertrain, the head unit CAN bus, the HMI CAN, and etc. It also connects some other protocols, example Link, MOS, FlexRay, and it can either translate or filter them to the design and needs of the other ECUs. And then we have the head unit, which both are running on Wi-Fi and have the capability to perform OTA, which is over-the-air updates. And I think in Singapore's context should not be active, but in other countries it may be feasible to do so. Okay, so they also both have the telematic communication box, which is a TCB, and for bench 3 it's got the Hermes as mentioned by Alina, that connects the head unit, which enables a 4G LTE connection. So how they're doing this is that the TCB or the T-box has the embedded SIM. And then we have the Ethernet switch in bench 2 and a direct Ethernet connection on bench 3, connecting from cluster to head unit. So as far as we can tell for our purpose of the bench setup, there are no stark differences in this vehicle architecture, except on their naming and design technology use. So a summary of our learnings. So some of our learnings and challenges through bench 2, it was quite evident that there are no message signing properties to prevent attacks on the CAN bus. So once you're in the CAN bus and have the, let's say, the wake up signal in the bench setup, you're actually free to do whatever you want, acting as a rogue ECU. So message signing can actually be very expensive to implement. And one way that we discovered they were trying to prevent such layman attacks is through the central gateway. So the central gateway will mostly filter out unwanted CAN messages. So going through a traditional way of connecting to the OE2 and injecting CAN messages is actually not possible. So for bench 3, there is a form of protection in the anti-theft module. So in an active vehicle, doing CAN plus replace will actually cause the anti-theft to activate on the infotainment system, which earlier mentioned is the level C. Or if you were to mix and match the parts and their VIN numbers do not match, the anti-theft system will actually activate and prevent you from doing further research. So this actually makes it challenging to build the bench 3. And removing the anti-theft permanently is also a tall task, unless a refresh of the chip is done to remove the anti-theft. However, refreshing is not recommended as a wrong parameter may potentially damage or break the board. So the best effort that we can do is to continuously simulate the ignition signals to remove level A anti-theft prompts and temporarily disable the function. And so far, from what we can see, the level A anti-theft protection has not hindered us too much and is very easy to rectify. So moving on, CSQ has actually built 3 benches so far. And as we beef up the continuous effort to build and understand more connected vehicle architectures, we're also in the midst of performing more tests, which can include telematics, remote attacks, key fob infotainment, ECU testing, and also some side channel attacks. And more excitingly, we are also looking into the architectures of electric vehicles as well as autonomous vehicles, and hope that we will be able to bring this experience to you soon. So I think that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
Yeah, you also can actually post the questions in the chat and we'll be here to respond. And afterwards for tomorrow, we also have our workshop. So our workshop will go through the hands-on attacks or hands-on things that you can do with CAN bus and as well as the diagnostics functionality within the vehicles. Okay, so thank you very much.